Welcome to today's webinar, Learning at Lunch. This is the second webinar in our four-part series. Today, we'll hear from Jon Welsh on the biodiversity credits and opportunities for the biodiversity market. My name is Razak Shorka. I'm a land services officer in the Sustainable Agriculture team at Northwest Local Land Services. I'm also the project manager for the valuing natural assets on the farm in the Northwest region. This webinar is supported by the Australian government through funding from the Natural Heritage Trust under the Climate Smart Agriculture Program. The acknowledgement, Local Land Services acknowledges that it stands on country which always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and waters, and we show our respect for elders past, present, and emerging. We are committed to providing places in which Aboriginal people are included socially, culturally, and economically through the thoughtful and collaborative approaches to our work. Just a bit of a housekeeping for today's webinar. The session is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel for viewing later. We'll also email you the recorded version for your convenience. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the session using only the Q&A function, not the chat function on your screen. You will find the QA function at the top of your screen. I think next to the chat, I think. There will be a feedback survey. We want to capture information about your knowledge base before the start of the presentation. So please fill out the pre-event survey, which will show you before the start of the presentation. And there will be a post-event survey, which will show you after the Q&A session. We value your feedback, and this helps us to deliver the content you like to see in the future. We developed a fact sheet covering the key points and links for further resources, which will be emailed to you after the webinar. Our today's speaker is Jon Welsh. Jon is an agricultural economist with Ag Econ Australia. Jon has been studying environmental markets and opportunities for landholders since 2013, with a key focus on relevance to broadacre farmers. Jon also has farming interest and has clients that include mining companies, research corporations, commercial irrigators, and universities. I will now go on to hand over to our today's speaker, Jon Welsh. But before that, we'll do the quick pre-event survey. And then, Jon, would you mind sharing your screen after that? Thank you.
Thanks, Razak. Will I wait for you to do the poll?
I will do the pre-event survey. So I'm going to launch that one. So I hope you'll be able to see on top of your screen.
Okay, you say when,
Yep.
Razak, and I'll kick off.
Yep. Awesome. Over to you, Jon. Thank you.
Okay, welcome everyone. The next 40 minutes or so, we're going to step through a 101 explainer of biodiversity markets for Northwest New South Wales. And yeah, really start off with the basics and step through some analysis that's been done and why this is becoming such a topical area of focus for supply chains in ag, policymakers, developers, and anyone that's in that offset market. So biodiversity in the news, the investment community, venture capitalists, banks, lots of the financial sector is trying really hard to find a way to monetize natural capital because they see value in it. You've got there the world's biggest fund manager, BlackRock, diligently trying to come up with ways where we can trade natural capital as a currency. And how do we go about acknowledging that? The federal government is trying to build a nature repair market where everyone is on the one currency. At the moment, we've got jurisdictional policy, depending on what state you're in. We've got some examples there on the bottom of your slide with articles about farmers certainly participating in these initiatives. And on your bottom right there, a world first nature repair market project. There's various different methods of acknowledging or monetizing your nature repair or your biodiversity on your farm. A bit of lingo there with natural capital, nature repair or biodiversity. It's all the same thing, depending on the spin the journalist wants to put on the article or what the policy preference is. So what we're going to cover off today, defining biodiversity markets, then having a quick look at those hybrid markets where you've got carbon credits and biodiversity being acknowledged in the one credit. Then we've got a different market that's not so common or understood, and that's the voluntary market where you can trade your biodiversity credits to different third parties. But the main attention will be on the New South Wales biodiversity example. The New South Wales market is the most advanced biodiversity market in Australia. They've set up kind of a market-based trading system as opposed to somewhere else like Queensland, who's got fixed values for credits. And then have a look at co-benefits, why this is important in a growing sustainability setting for ag producers. What is biodiversity? Well, if you look at the definition, it's a word we're hearing more of these days. It's basically plant and animal life on your farm that can be considered important and desirable. So an actual credit seeks to define some boundaries around what that credit is, whether it's a plant or an animal species, and to determine what that actual credit entails so it can be traded. The types of markets, spelling this out in the agenda a couple of slides ago, defining those market types. So there are a bunch of different credits you can kind of steer your operation towards depending on the species you've got. One example is the hybrid carbon markets. We've got a government carbon project platform where there's kind of a premium added to that carbon project if you can demonstrate you've got koalas, for example, in that woodland, or you're planting trees surrounding a habitat with koalas in it. And instead of receiving $35 per tonne of CO2 equivalents, there's generally a premium over and above that. They kind of attach that credit biodiversity premium to the carbon value. So it's kind of all bundled up together in a hybrid credit. Then we've got our voluntary markets, which are less understood. They can be traded domestically or internationally, depending on the platform, again, you want to use and the method of registering those credits. But the one most familiar to all of us in New South Wales would be the New South Wales BCT. And there's another one, of course, the Queensland offset market, which is probably the next most advanced system in Australia. So the marketing concept of registering credits and selling them to liable parties is one that's been implemented across 33 different countries at the last count. That was coming from a journal article that was a year or so old. So it's not something that's particularly confined to Australia. And it is, the traditional economist way of, all right, well, let's set up a market to buy and sell and let the market do the work. The government sets it up and then basically starts the flywheel for a market to eventuate after that. So as I mentioned, here's an example of a carbon project with a koala add-on, a biodiversity koala or habitat add-on. So the premium per tonne is just depending on what the different scheme is, whether it's an emissions reduction fund carbon scheme or a state-based scheme. These are becoming a little bit more common because carbon project interest is growing, and there's generally, it may not be a koala, it may be potentially a greater glider. I think that the government in the carbon emissions reduction fund space is becoming more amenable to altering carbon projects to capture dual sort of purpose with fauna and flora, particularly in regards to eucalypt woodlands and native revegetation. What are voluntary biodiversity markets? Well, there's some international platforms. There's 15 of them actually, which is problematic when you've got buyers and sellers. It's like having 15 currencies. So there's 15 different voluntary schemes that we know of from an analysis done by the author there on the bottom of this slide. And the main features are each of them measure and validate the species within that plant and animal community differently. Some use remote sensing, like downforce technologies on your screen there, who do everything remotely with very few boots on the ground. And that's the really expensive bit with biodiversity markets in general, is getting an ecologist to come out and actually, set up camera traps and do all those things. But that's not necessarily a prelude to setting something up. So it can be done remotely. Then you have a method, which is kind of the same as a carbon method, where you have like a recipe. And you can have bundled crediting as well with animals and plants as well. And it's ultimately, this is a contract that you'll be entering into with a party that wants to buy those credits, and there'll be strict guidelines around maintaining that landscape and improving it over time, with site-specific monitoring to make sure that the buyer, when they're handing over money for credits, that they can see that there's good integrity in measurement of those credits, and that the actual species will improve over time. So that's the general premise of someone buying a credit, knowing that those credits are going to be A, genuine, and B, the site is going to improve over time as a preference to just maintaining. But yeah, there's a really good reference there of a very thorough overview of those voluntary markets. So the New South Wales offset scheme is this slide. I guess this is a compliance market. So this is the big stick compliance market. So you've got big infrastructure projects mainly, or even housing and developer projects. And the government set up a compliance market. So when there's an ecosystem or plant community disturbed for development, the government ensures that when they're doing their development application, that they have secured offset credits. Now, that the formula for what's offset depends on the species. Grassy woodlands, for example, I'm not sure of the exact equation, but they're a very rare species in the northwest slopes. If a hectare of grassy woodland is disturbed, there's an equation. I just don't know what it is exactly, depending on the availability of those credits or the value of those credits. And the inland rail, for example, would have to go and secure those credits elsewhere, preferably within a 100-kilometre radius of that disturbance. So examples of that I've got on your screen there, just with a few different logos. RMS, so for example, north of Narrabri, where they extended the overtaking lanes near Ballatta, they disturbed a heap of Crown Reserve there, untouched plant communities and wildlife as well. And the RMS had to go and look for credits to offset that extra lane on the overtaking there. So that's one example. You've got Alkane Resources that have got mining interests in central New South Wales. You've got, again, New South Wales government with requirements that they may just want to, due to their charter, the environmental charter, may just want to secure really valuable sites in your region. If you've got really good credits for koalas or whatever else, they may come in and secure those credits. And then, of course, you've got your solar farms and your wind farms that disturb when they put roads in or wind turbines or panels. Those developers must go and find those credits. And consultants tend to be the main conduit for finding credits from landholders, or they issue, or the BCT issues a tender routinely to try and flush out people that are considering supplying the credit market. So landholders are becoming more and more approached in a B2B transaction and just negotiating credits outside of the tender process. That seems to be a preference of quite a few developers that I've spoken with anecdotally, and others that have participated in this market. So just the B2B approach of, you know, I've got credits, you've got a need, let's nut out a deal of what we think they're worth, and draw up a contract and go from there. So anyone considering registering a paddock out the back that hasn't been disturbed and there's some remnant vegetation and some valuable species in there, I've just got a decision flowchart here on how you would go about considering drafting up or exploring a project. Eligibility, engaging an accredited assessor. So I guess there's two very preliminary things that I would do and have done. And that is, one, to spend about $1,000. And if you think you've got something of value, there are some free online tools. You can get an idea of your eucalypt or your old growth vegetation on your farm. A few of those sites. And if you think you've got something valuable like peppermint or grey box woodlands or brigalow or those species in the slopes and plains areas, well, there's a pretty high chance that that you could have some value there, particularly if it's been untouched over a period of time. So number one, engage an accredited assessor just to do a feasibility of your site. You would give them a polygon area of the site under investigation, and they would map with a reasonably high degree of accuracy of what species you would have there, probably for $1,000 to $2,000 to give you a bit of an idea, and they would likely give you some feedback on the demand for those credits. So you can do that reasonably cheaply. It's a shame we don't have government resources and extension resources to do that for us. But you know, there are still reasonably cost-effective ways you can do that. And the second one is to find liable parties. That flowchart probably isn't exactly in order. A liable party will have a big development, you know, within your vicinity, because they have restrictions of how far they can trade, depending on the rarity of those species. But generally, if you've got an indication from your assessor, or you know yourself, you've got something really valuable, and you've got demand for those credits, well, then all of a sudden you've got the two key things that matter in a biodiversity project. If you've got one or the other, you don't have many valuable species, and you do have liable parties, well, that's probably not much good. But in my case, in here at Gyra, where I live, we've got some really valuable credits and not many developments. So we're waiting for the Energy Co power line to come into this area to create some demand for credits with the 400 acres that I've got locked up at the moment. And then once you're actually comfortable with the buying and selling, or you think you've got enough interest there to generate some sort of demand for your credits, engage in an assessor to conduct field surveys. This is a really expensive bit, and they will come up with a management plan for you to manage that area that you potentially can lock up and sign an agreement with the BCT for. You have to manage the site with reporting obligations. So pick out a few various random areas in that site once you've signed the agreement to agree to put in the contract. But I guess in doing so, you really need to know that you've got demand for those credits and not do what I did and go and get everything surveyed without really having a party there to come in and buy your credits after you spent that money. And then you actually sign what is quite a detailed agreement as to how you're going to manage that site once you've agreed with a price for a counterparty for those credits. So there's a bit of detail in it, but certainly the rewards are there in this current market. I did some analysis for the Cotton Research and Development Corporation on this, and certainly acknowledging that work that was funded by them and the work was done by us. I've just costed out in a gross margin what a project would look like on, roughly a 400 acre, or might have been hectares, I think, in the Western Division. So your costs there in the middle column just show, roughly, I've probably overinflated that desktop review. I'm not sure whether it'd be 2,500. Then the site mapping and surveying is expensive. Well, in comparison to the desktop survey. Then you've got a lodgement fee, which is pretty standard. Legal and accounting advices. That's a very, very important one. So it does trigger a capital gain event, which is a real actual nuisance to manage. And apparently the ATO are going to have a specific ruling on biodiversity projects because that back paddock may be valued at $100 an acre. And when you create a credit, which is certainly going to change the income and the value of that back paddock, that's seen as triggering a capital gain event. And that's something you have to manage with your accountant and tax and legal advisors, which is something that can't be overlooked. And you don't want to get yourself in a position where you're under scrutiny with audits, etc. So you do need to get some good advice on that. And then costing out as well, if you're grazing that backcountry, you've got interest on the money that you've spent to develop the site, and then you might have to forego some opportunity cost of lost production if you are grazing that site through the winter months, for example, when feed's scarce on the rest of your farm. But having said that, the benefits, for example, on the right-hand column, and this is using some quite old credit values, and we don't have the transparency on the credit values that we used to have. You've got a revenue line item there on that right-hand side, which is not insignificant. So very different quantums when you're looking at what a project can generate in comparison to soil carbon projects, for example. The biodiversity is getting much, much more interest than carbon projects generally with the work we do with industry. So are there any questions, Razak, before I go off that project gross margin there? That's just an example. As I've mentioned, I think it is a 400 hectare project, and there's a link down the bottom there that people can access that full 4-page document.
No, there is no question at this moment, John. Thank you. I also put the link on the chat if
Sure.
Yep, thank you.
Trading rules. There is a bit of complexity with trading rules, but there certainly is favouritism when you've got a really rare plant community or a really rare animal. Animals can generally be traded anywhere in the state, in New South Wales, far more easily than plant communities can. So the more threatened plant communities that have been that have a really high clearing percentage and are considered threatened can be traded more freely than those that are more middle of the road, for example. So an example there is some box gums and grasslands are really, really rare and are highly sought after. So yeah, they can be traded in a kind of through a different lens than something that's more mainstream, like Pilliga pine forest, for example. Less endangered ecology, yeah, must be traded in an adjoining bioregion. And animals there, glossy black cockatoos in the photo, for example. Little microbats are quite highly sought after as well. You've got pygmy possums and koalas as well that can be, once they're quantified and the credits are generated, they can be traded throughout the state. Lots of other considerations. There's a bit of detail in this. Yeah, so a desktop assessment is useful. Are there any big projects in your region? And where can I find out? So if you pick up the local news, you can pretty much trawl through what's going on in your area. If not, there's certainly the Department of Planning, New South Wales Department of Planning website that'll register all the projects in your area or in the state. And you can investigate, is it an extractive industry where they're clearing the top surface of the land, or is it a mine that won't really touch vegetation? Is it a wind farm or a solar farm? Is there a need for lots of roads? Is there a highway upgrade in my area? within 100, 200 kilometres. All those sorts of things. You can do your own research on what credits may be in demand in your area. If not, there's always the consultant that does your desktop survey will normally have a bit of an idea of what's going on in your area, particularly where there's an inland rail or a big renewable energy project, for example. If I have a project, can I use the land? This is a fairly sensitive area in New South Wales, unlike Queensland. In Queensland, the Queensland government's quite prepared for you to graze your site and lock it up, depending on your management strategy. But normally they're more lenient when it comes to grazing, for particularly bushfire mitigation. That's something you have to negotiate, and I have heard varied stories upon, what access you have, whether it's a month or two, or whether it's more like 6 months of the year to keep the fuel down in that area and keep the ground cover down. So if there's a lightning strike, you don't lose everything. Capital gains tax liability is a big one, and it is one annoying bugbear of this process, to make sure that you're not giving yourself a huge headache with tax implications. Where to for help? OEH does have phone and email support, but it's very thin. It's very thin, and I guess that's one of my limitations I experienced here, was the kind of lack of resources you have, other than maybe a little bit of email. Very, very difficult to get someone on the phone in the OEH department to explain things. Basic extension is a real challenge, I found. Hence, we have to rely on consultants to bridge that gap, and the meter's running when that happens, as we all know. So, and also to note that carbon projects can coexist with biodiversity projects. So it's a bit like apples and oranges. So you can have, a locked up piece of remnant vegetation. I'm just not sure how you go with securing that as a carbon project, because you've kind of got to meet additionality criteria for a carbon project. But with a biodiversity project, that's very much a standalone, separate project than a carbon project, or they can be bundled together in some instances. So why are non-cropped areas so important? Well, this is a focus of industry and supply chains and consumers as well, with farms that are either carbon positive or carbon neutral or carbon negative, so in the red, so you emit more carbon than you sequester. I've just got some generic numbers there from Rhiannon Smith's research showing how much these non-cropped areas can sequester. And you've got your riparian river redgum there, with generally their feet down in water, sequester huge amounts of CO2 per hectare per year. So not only do they house or they have terrific biodiversity in some of those redgum woodlands and riparian zones that can potentially make up a biodiversity project, but their sequestration is just enormous. And then we've got a big gap there between first and second, really, haven't we, between the rest of those species, brigalow, poplar box and coolabah, and then coming down to what a really deep perennial pasture can sequester. You're looking at really about a tonne per hectare per year of CO2 equivalents. So, about sort of 15% of what a river redgum per hectare would sequester. So, yeah, there are dual benefits, and there certainly is always conversations about carbon and biodiversity occurring more and more at the moment. So just on the carbon balance side of things, the Dryland Cotton Research Association, we did 3 case study analysis, and just due to sequestration from trees, which is your non-cropped areas with biodiversity, all 3 of those areas had riparian red gums, and well, I guess the Douglas Station in the Northern Territory had just lots of non-cropped areas. And you can see there that the black line, the net emissions, once cropping was, all the emissions from cropping were calculated, and houses, etc. But all of those 3 farms were below the line when it came to sequestering more than they emit. We just thought that'd be worth showing you the value of these non-cropped areas. Why is understanding farm emissions important? Well, it's kind of related, but it's a little bit off topic to biodiversity. But ASRS is a policy that was introduced on the 1st of January this year. And the really big companies, which may include commodity merchants such as Cargill and Olam, for example, they have to go down and find their report on their Scope 3 emissions of their supply chain customers. And we have had quite a bit of interest from Rabobank and Commonwealth Bank in the cotton industry, contacting growers to try and gather up primary data to secure their numbers they need for their compulsory reporting of emissions. And so I guess it pays to know about your species and what you've got in your non-cropped areas and potentially your riparian zones. And this is affecting all of us. It's not something we can kind of avoid indefinitely. So biodiversity as a non-tariff trade barrier. Now, this is the co-benefits part of the session. Consumers are becoming more and more aware of not just the carbon balance. The carbon balance in some respects with consumers is becoming more of a backseat. And the biodiversity stewardship piece is becoming more and more emphasised from the consumers in more recent times. And customers such as brand apparels in the fibre market are seeking to actually for you to nominate where your goods were produced and provide a polygon map so customers can investigate over time of whether your biodiversity is improving on your farm. We certainly had some experience with that with one particular brand of our merino wool, and yeah, software can map the health of those non-cropped areas over time. And I've just got a few examples there of fibre brands and that are interested in carbon and biodiversity as a selling point for products. And we've got the EU biofuels as well, which are offering premiums for farms that can demonstrate good environmental stewardship. So not just a carbon project or a biodiversity project anymore. It's about stewardship and long-term monitoring of sites to ensure that species and plant communities remain healthy into the future. So just to kind of wrap up, that back paddock. So what do we do? So if you can identify the possible endangered flora and fauna yourself is really a kind of an interesting thing to exercise to do yourself. What sort of species have I got? And most farmers tend to know a whole lot about their native veg on their farm, in my experience. River red gums, do you own a riparian zone? If you've got river red gums, there's a really high chance you're probably going to have a carbon positive or a very carbon friendly carbon balance sheet. Test the waters with a desktop study. I think concurrently to that, you need to have a look at any big projects within a 100-kilometre radius of you just to see what type of credits may be in demand and what sort of volume of credits to understand sort of step by step whether you've got the potential to explore the project costs and benefits. And the development applications, New South Wales Department of Planning will list those, but big renewable or infrastructure projects certainly are a dead giveaway for parties that will need to go and find credits in your bioregion. So just a summary here, there's very little downside from doing a lot of the work yourself to have a look at what's in that back paddock or that riparian zone yourself. And there are some basic local lands resources that may be able to help understand your flora and fauna. There's some links here I'll show you at the end where you can actually explore the list and you know what is actually in your area. And co-benefits, so actually registering your species you've got on your farm and showing that you're a biodiversity steward is becoming more important in premium agricultural markets where customers want to know that your carbon balance sheet might be, static or positive, but do you have a D9 out in the backyard, in the back paddock, clearing en masse? They're the things that the customers are really concerned with. Yeah, so as a business case, industry studies have shown that benefits far exceed, agronomically or whatever from a carbon project. And biodiversity and carbon projects can be done separately with each other without conflicts, or bundled into a hybrid, as I've shown there with koalas. Some resources here. This is the tool I was mentioning a moment ago. Cotton Info's put together a map, an interactive map, where you can click on your local government area, and that will list all the endangered fauna and plant community types in that area. And there's a pretty high chance that once those are listed there, that you may well have some of those on your farm. And RASAC has provided, put together a fact sheet, and a lot of these links are on that fact sheet. So yeah, you can certainly access that at any time once this is over. I think, RASAC, you'll be circulating that when we finish up.
Yep. Okay.
Well, that's it from me. That's it from me. Hopefully there's some information there that might be valuable to people.
Yep, and we got a couple of questions coming up. So yep, so we'll maybe jump on to the Q&A session. So I think so sorry, I just got a question lately when you finished talking on that slide. Like, is there any question? So Andrew, so there's a question that you showed on the table, like 1.7 million. Was that over 25 years?
That's right. I'll just go back to that budget.
Yep.
So that 1.7 will be divided into two parts. There'll be a calculation done for what's called a TFD, a total fund deposit, here in the middle of this column here. So the total fund deposit gets paid out to you in increments for your management over a period of time, and then the balance you've got to deal with yourself, and there's always tax and capital gains implications for that. So yeah, depending on the size of the site, Andrew, there's potentially 30-35% goes into a bank account and then gets paid out to you over time, and the remainder is yours to keep, and you can transact that depending on your accounting advice and your legal advice on how best to deal with that.
Thank you, John. We got another question. What are the minimum areas that might be possible?
Well, that's a really good point, because minimum areas, if your site's too small, you don't have enough in your total fund deposit to pay you to manage that site. I guess that's why I've used a 400 hectare example from the Western Division, because you do need, I guess depending on where you are and what sort of credit plant community types you're dealing with, if you've got a really valuable small area with highly sought after credits, that's going to be a lot more viable. If you've got lower demand credits, you need a bigger area. So the challenge is that the challenge is to actually the challenge is to pay your total fund deposit and to have enough left over. So, to make it really worth your while, you have to have a decent sized project. So again, it's a bit of a case, unfortunately, to give you a generic answer, it's a bit of a case by case basis, depending on what credit species you've got and what's going to be the total earning capacity of that site. Razak?
Thank you, John. So yeah, so while listening to you, because this is a fairly new topic for me, I'm trying to get some understanding. So I got questions like, what are the best things about setting up a biodiversity project?
Well, I guess we were motivated because we had an unusable piece of land, really. It was a bit too rough and too delicate to to go in and develop that for grazing or farming purposes. So this was a big value proposition for us. So we had quite a few endangered flora and fauna there that we thought was just a good idea as well. Not only the fact that we couldn't develop it. And I think in the future, as we sell our products into premium beef or wool or markets, that being able to demonstrate that you've got a registered biodiversity, you're a registered steward, I think that's going to go some way to consumer preference, and accessing a lot of these high value markets to demonstrate that stewardship. So they're certainly the best things. I think this is an area that's getting more attention in the supply chain, biodiversity, as opposed to carbon balance in the landscape. Razak?
Yep. Thank you, John. So I got another question. I'm just trying to relate this biodiversity credit and biodiversity market with the project that we are running at this moment. So people are managing natural assets on farm. So I mean perennial pastures and farm dam and riparian areas through different management activities such as rotational grazing for perennial pastures or enhancing farm dam for better water quality. So my question is that how will entering the biodiversity market help the landholder or property manager who is actively managing those natural assets on farm?
Well, I guess it's quantifying the health of the landscape. There is certainly monitoring, which is quite rigorous. If you register a project, you have to quantify various plant and animal populations, for example, or change in that landscape to ensure that the biodiversity is improving. If you're not doing that, you don't really know. So there is a lot of learning along the way. It is quite scientific how they measure biodiversity health. So I think there's a big learning curve there, and we've actually got a landholder on here, Razak, Warwick Moffat, who's joined the call. Warwick's transacted a few different biodiversity trades, so he's probably really well placed to answer that. Why would you choose a project over not doing one? If Warwick, more than willing to take the mic, Warwick. Not so we might hear from him a bit later anyway, Razak, but yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Yep. Thank you, John. Yeah, that is actually, thank you. So now I hope that information is also helpful for other people joined here and will be listening to this webinar later. So yeah, I think I got some other question as well. So because we are trying to get some understanding on this. So how would you demonstrate to your supply chain you are actively managing biodiversity on your farm?
If you've got a stewardship site like we do here, not that we've transacted any credits yet, we've got an actual document to say that we have a registered project that we can trade with. I think that's very powerful. It does show you've put a lot of research and effort into understanding what species you're managing. I think that's a great first step. How we actually quantify that to our customers, in Europe or wherever we send our goods to, look, it's the real challenge. This is the next kind of step change into communicating to consumers that as agricultural producers, that we're actually looking after our non-cropped areas, which is becoming so important. But yeah, I don't really know the answer to that, to be honest. How do we validate that to our customers in the supply chain? Other than a stewardship formal document that I've got, it's very, very difficult if you don't have that, I guess. It's a bit like, signing a kind of just a statement that you've got some non-cropped areas and you're looking after them to the best of your ability or whatever. But in my case, we've gone to the effort to quantify and validate that everything that we're looking after and how many credits that we've got of each.
Yep. Thanks. Thank you, John. I think we sorted out our week. So would you mind turning on your mic and you can start talking? Is that Warwick Muppet? Did you mention John? So I think we unmuted him. So if he would like, he can speak.
Yeah, it's still showing mute there, Razak, on his icon.
Yeah. Yeah, I think he has to. Emma.
Yeah, Warwick, if you wanted to join in, you just have to unmute yourself at the top of the screen up next to where it says share if you wanted to. I've unmuted you so you can speak. You just have to unmute yourself as well.
He's probably having a really good chat to himself.
He might just be having some technical difficulties. That's all right. We might move on and come back to him.
So, yep. I think got some more questions. Oh, so Warwick, he's still trying. But yeah. So yep. So yep. So yep. We put together all the information that the key points that John has discussed today. So we'll send out that fact sheet covering all the key points and links that John talked about today to you after this webinar. And again, we have recorded this webinar and we'll send this to you. We'll email you the link so that you can watch it later. So before we wrapping up, so is there any questions? Nope. Okay, so if you'd like to know more about our project, I mean the Valuing Natural Assets on Farm project, feel free to contact me or you can reach out to your local land services office in Northwest region. And if you'd like to know more about natural capital or need support managing natural capital on your farm and the carbon market, please contact Andrew Jack, who is our natural capital advisor for Northwest Local Land Services. And if you have any questions or inquiries regarding biodiversity offset program, please reach out to the Biodiversity Conservation Trust for further guidance and advice. If you have any biodiversity credit related questions, please go to POTSE, which is Planning, Offset and Threatened Species Ecosystem Division. Yep. Thank you for joining us today. We got something from Warwick. Maybe. Sorry, there is some technical issue from Ori. He could not able to unmute himself, unfortunately. But thank you. I think if there is anything Warwick you would like to add, you can send it to me, and then I will maybe add to our fact sheet so that people will know about what you wanted to cover today. Thank you all for joining us today, and we will have our next webinar in this series next Wednesday at the same time. We will hear from Liz Blair, who will talk about more about managing fauna and how and biodiversity related things. Thank you. I hope I will be able to see you in next webinar next week. Thank you.